Stuart, we're ready. Okay. Right, good morning everyone, and welcome to the Local Pensions Board meeting, the last one of this year. And thank you very much for those who have made it in person, considering everything that's happening. Thank you very much for that. What we shall do is we shall start off with some introductions, because we've got a presentation coming up. So what I'll do is I'll start with myself, and then we'll work through Martin, and then go around that way, and then we shall officially start the meeting. My name is Tulani Malife, and I'm chair of the board.
Good morning, I'm Martin Gately, and I'm the clerk to the Pensions Board.
Morning, I'm John Clues, I'm the pension admin manager.
Morning, Keith Palfreman, Group Manager Finance at the County Council.
Okay. Sorry, David Smith. I'm a Finance Director of Autism East Midlands, and I'm an employer representative.
County Councillor Francis Purdy-Horan, the County Council representative on the Pensions Board.
Mark Eppinstall, scheme member representing GMB Union. Thank you.
And actually that works out quite nice as a reminder for everybody's phones. And if we can start with the people on Zoom. John, would you like to start? Oh, sorry, can you put your mic on, please?
Sorry, Chair. John Rose, an advisor to the board.
I think we've got Kieran.
Hi, yeah, Kieran Guilfoyle. I work on the investments team on the investment side of the pension fund.
And then finally, but not least, Barry was going to be giving us a presentation.
Hi, morning everyone. I'm Barry Mackay. I'm the fund actuary. I work at Barnet Waddingham.
Thank you very much. And just as a reminder, if you're not talking, could you switch off your mics? Only because we can pick up additional noise. And also, for us in the meeting, that unfortunately the way that it works is if somebody's on Teams and our microphones are on, there might be a chance that we'll get an echo or a reverberation. So when that happens, please just ensure that you switched yourselves off. Thank you. All right, we shall start off with the first item of the business on the agenda, which are the minutes of the last meeting held on the 30th of September, 2021. Just a question for those who are here. Is that a true and fair reflection of the meeting that we had? And are there any points of accuracy or clarification or amendments? No. If that's fine, I'm happy to move. Will somebody second it for me? Thank you, Councillor Purdue. All right. The next item on the agenda is apologies. Have we got any apologies for absence?
We do, Chairman. So we've got one apology for absence from Councillor Sally Longford, who is on other City Council business.
Thank you very much. Next item is the declarations of interest by members and officers. And this is further explained on the back page of the agenda under item 3. So has anybody got any declarations of interest, members or officers? Thank you. We'll swiftly move on to item 4, which is the actuary's report and presentation by Barry Mackay from Barnet Waddington. And this is just a report for us to note about the upcoming triannual valuation. Barry, if you'd like to take us through. Thank you very much. Actually, just as a secondary question, do you want questions during the presentation or at the end?
Thanks, Chair. I'm happy to take questions as we go, if that makes sometimes makes more sense when you're on that topic. Okay. But whatever suits you.
All right. Thank you very much. So it's over to you, Barry.
Okay, I will hopefully share my screen. Can everyone see the slides?
We can.
Okay, I'll just use the meeting pack so they're all on the same page. Okay, thanks, Chair. Yeah, unfortunately, my colleague Kelly isn't with me today. She was going to present, but it's just you just have to suffer me, I'm afraid, for the whole time. So I am the fund actuary and have been for a number of years now. I carried out the 2019 valuation, and as the chair said, there's a triennial valuation, so it occurs once every 3 years. So the next valuation of the fund is at 31st March 2022. So we thought it'd be useful to have a training session on what the valuation's all about. So I'll just move on to the next page. This is what we're going to cover today. So what is a valuation? How do we value the assets and liabilities? And how do we set contribution rates, which are then payable by each employer in the fund over the next 3 years? And finally, just finishing up with some hot topics that will impact the valuation. There's always lots going on in the LGPS. As I said, happy to take questions as we go. I can hopefully see people raising their hand, but if I miss that, just shout. So the first section, what is a valuation? If we move on to page 14 of your meeting pack, the assets are fairly straightforward because you'll have the market value of each of your asset types, asset classes, and therefore we'll know what that is. The liabilities, unfortunately, are much more difficult. So the assets are how much money do you have, and the liabilities are effectively how much money should you have to be able to pay all the benefits that have accrued to all the members by the valuation date. And therefore, there's lots of assumptions that go into those calculations, and we'll talk more about those in a moment. And the last part is, once we know the assets and liabilities, we can then set the contributions. Now, the employees, as you probably know, pay contributions, but they're fixed, or at least are set by pay bands that are set out in the regulations. The employer contributions are, in the LGPS, is a balance of cost scheme. So when we actually works out the total contribution rate to be paid to meet the cost of benefits accrued by that employer's members, then we knock off the employee contributions, and whatever's left the employer has to pay. So there is always a bit of a balancing act at the valuation. On one hand, we're trying to look after the fund and make sure that you have enough money to pay all the benefits, which is a constantly sort of moving target. On the other hand, we need to make sure contributions are affordable and as stable as possible, so that employers can meet those cash calls. So that's the balance of the valuation. How do we do this? So we'll go into quite a bit of detail on how we value the liabilities. The next couple of slides or pages, 15 and 16, are the kind of a very high level of approach of how we do it, methodology. So what you can see on page 15 is the actual cash flows, or the estimated rather cash flows that will be paid out for a typical LGPS fund. So each fund has active members, those current employees, deferred members who are members who used to be employees, who have left the participation in the LGPS or rather the fund, and are waiting to receive a benefit when they retire, and pensioners who are currently receiving a benefit in payment. And if you added up all those payments, then you get this kind of hump of cash flows over the next 60, 70 years, and that's what makes it so difficult to estimate the liabilities, because you're paying out these benefits over a long period of time. You can imagine a 20-year-old member or employee joining the scheme today and still receiving benefits when they're 90. So it's a long-term game. So we project all these possible benefit payments into the future, allowing for lots of assumptions, as I say, things like inflation, because the benefits will increase in line with inflation. How long will people live? When will they retire? And so on. And we create this sort of cash flow hump, as you can see on page 15. And then what we do is, and this is kind of the crux of what it actually does, we discount them. And by discounting, we mean we bring all those cash flows back to a current time, so present day. And to do that, we use what we call the discount rate, which is a prudent estimate of the future expected investment returns. So a simple example would be if I have to pay, if the fund has to pay someone £100 in 2 years' time, and you think you can generate 5% investment return per annum, then you would discount that £100 back to today, so for 2 years, and you'd only need to hold £90 today, because in 2 years' time, that £90 would have increased approximately to £100 with your 5% return. And so we do that for every member in the fund, and for every cash flow we think we have to pay out, and bring it all back to the valuation date, which in this case is 31st March 2022. And that gives us our, what we call the value, estimated value of the liabilities at the valuation date. And then we compare the value of the liabilities with the assets.
Excuse me, Barry, can I just interrupt and ask a question, please?
Sure.
What is the scale on the left-hand side? Obviously, it's 0 to 100. Is that percentage or what?
It's just it's nothing really. It's because the typical LGPS fund, it's just a sort of nominal rebase scale. In fact, if you looked at the Nottinghamshire pension fund and added up all the cash flows, you probably, if you go back to page 15, you probably have around 18 billion, which is a frightening number, about 18 billion pounds to pay out over that's been accrued to date over the next 60, 70 years. And then a general rule of thumb is when we discount those, you end up with about a third of those. The value of placed liabilities will be around 6 billion. So you can just kind of ignore the left-hand scale. So this isn't the cash flows for your fund as such, as a sort of typical example LGPS fund. But hopefully that makes sense, the discounting part. So that's the process we go through, and as I say, we'll go into the assumptions and so on in a bit more detail in a moment. At the last valuation, so on page 17 of your meeting pack, we show where you were. So this is at 31st March 2019, so 2.5 years ago. The liability value that we estimated at that point was 5.8 billion, and the market value of assets you had at that point was 5.4. So you were a little bit short in the money that you were holding relative to the money we think you needed to pay all the benefits, and that equated to a funding level of 93%. So that's just the ratio of the assets over the liabilities. So around a £400 million shortfall. But that was a good improvement on the previous valuation at 2016, which I think the fund level was around 87 or so. So you moved in the right direction. And in terms of the contributions that employers had to pay, every employer has their own contribution, but for the fund as a whole, the contribution rate was 21.6%, and that's made up of two elements. The first element is what we call the primary rate, and that is the cost of benefits that will accrue in the future. So for all those active employees, those active members, the contribution rate was around 18%. So as they accrue their care benefit going forward, and then because there's that deficit of 400 million, employers had to pay in a little bit more to remove that shortfall, and that's that extra bit of around 3.7%, the difference between the total and the primary rate. The other thing we need to be mindful of is that the Government Action Department carry out a Section 13 valuation, and that is just to check that they look at various elements, compliance, consistency, solvency, and long-term cost efficiency. And you just want to make sure you tick all the boxes, that you're looking after the fund appropriately, and they make lots of measures, far too many in my view, but they look at lots of measures and then they write a report. Happy to say that your fund achieved green flags on every measure, which is what you want, so there's no issues with the fund. Unbelievably, we're still waiting on the final Section 13 report. We expect it to be out before Christmas, but it's not really a lot of use given we're now almost at the next valuation. But anyway, the point here is that you don't need to worry about it. You passed all the Section 13 valuation tests, so that's good news. If we move on to how we value the liabilities in a bit more detail, we get the member data from the fund, John and his team, and it's vital that the data is as accurate and complete as possible, because that data underpins all the work we do. So as I said at the start, we're projecting every member and what we think the cash flows will be for each member in the future, and so that data is very important. We then make assumptions about what will happen to those member benefits. So they'll increase in line with inflation each year, or the older benefit will increase in line with salary increases, and so on. And so we build all that in, and then we estimate when we think each member will retire, and how long they will live, and we'll come on to mortality later as well. So that's all that assumptions part, and we put that all that into our models and run literally thousands of calculations and work out a liability not only for each individual employer, as it says on page 19, but actually for each individual member. But then sum them up by employer and sum them up by whole fund to get the different employer positions in the whole fund position. So I've mentioned a couple of times the importance of assumptions. The first set are the financial assumptions, and they determine effectively the amount you'll end up paying. And the three key ones are shown on page 20 here. So pension increases, because almost all the benefits increase in line with CPI, consumer price inflation now, which there's been a fair bit of news about inflation recently. The fact it's increasing, and we can chat about that later. Salary increases for those older final salary benefits, and then the key one is this discount rate. And it's so key, because a small change in this discount rate can make a big difference in the value we place on the liabilities, and that's due to the impact of compound interest, effectively, which I think it was Einstein that said it was the greatest force in the universe. So and it's back to that point I made, that if you added up all the benefit payments you had to make that have accrued to date, you'd need to have £18 billion in the fund. But in fact, because of compound interest, because you're a funded scheme, because you invest in all these different asset classes and you expect returns, you only need to hold around £6 billion today. So that makes a huge change in the value of the liabilities. So because it's so key, we'll spend just a minute or two talking about how we derive the discount rate on page 21. The way we do it at Barnett Waddingham is we look at each asset class you're holding. So equities, property, bonds, infrastructure, all these exciting investments that you've made. We then look at the best estimate return on each asset class, and then we take the weighted average. So that gives us the best estimate return for the strategic asset allocation, or the assets you're expecting to hold long term. Because the regulations say the action needs to be prudent at the time of valuation, we take a little bit off. So you've got a best estimate return, and we slice a little bit off, because that weights it in the favour of the fund. So best estimate by definition is 50% of the time you'll beat that best estimate return, and 50% you'll be under it. So by being a little bit prudent, you've gamed your chances to beating it more often than not. So for example, if the best estimate return was for the whole fund assets was 6%, they actually might use a discount rate of 5%. So there's a 1% prudence margin. And instead of being 50-50 of getting above or below 6%, you might now be sort of 70% chance of beating the 5% discount rate. So that's how we come up with our discount rate. It's obviously a lot more scientific than that, and we run lots of modelling and we speak to our investment colleagues and so on, but that's the gist of it. The smoothing part here is quite important. The other thing we do to try and reduce volatility, because pension funding is a very long-term game, we're more interested in the long term, not the short term. We span the market conditions that we look at over 6 months. So 3 months before the valuation date and 3 months after the valuation date. And that just smooths out any short-term market volatility that might happen. A great example would be March 20 last year. If we'd carried out a valuation at 31st March and didn't use a smoothing technique, markets had dropped by 10-15%, and therefore, you know, your valuation, which is meant to be long term, would have been based very much on a short term position, which, as we all know, kind of corrected by sort of May, June that same year. So it wouldn't have made much sense. So that's why we do that, so that we think that's really helpful for the fund and the employers. So just to clarify how this works in terms of each financial assumption, if the higher the inflation is, then that means, excuse me, all benefit payments will increase. So higher inflation, higher benefit payments, higher liabilities. And the same goes for salary. As you can imagine, the higher the salary is, the more increases members get, the greater the final salary benefit they'll get, and therefore the higher the value that we will place on that. It's going to cost a lot more to pay out a pension of £10,000 per annum than it is to pay out a pension of £5,000 per annum. It's kind of as simple as that. The discount rate works in reverse, which is kind of sometimes difficult to understand, a bit counterintuitive. But the higher a discount rate you have, the lower value you get on the liabilities. And that's back to the fact that if you use a higher discount rate, you're expecting your assets to generate more returns in the future, and therefore you need to hold less money now, if that makes sense. So back to the example of, if I have to pay £100 in 2 years, if I'm going to get an investment return of 5% per annum, I only hold £90 today. If I thought I was going to get 10% per annum, I'd only need to hold about £80 today. So the higher the discount rate, the lower the value we place in the liability. So it's the reverse of the other financial assumptions. So that's all saying financials. I don't know if there's any questions at that point before I move on to demographic assumptions. I'll keep going then.
Okay. Any questions? Any questions from the floor? No? I think,
Okay.
Barry, I think we can continue. I think everybody seems to be getting it, so thank you.
Okay, so on demographics, again, there's lots of assumptions we make. When will people retire? When the rate of people leaving, the rate of ill health retirements, which could be more of an issue given what's happened over the last 18 months or so. But the key one is mortality or longevity. Depends if you're a half full or a half glass full or half empty person. So mortality is the rate of death, I guess, and life expectancy is how long will people live, but it's effectively the same thing. And if we move on to page 24, these are the pieces of the jigsaw when we come to set our longevity assumption. It's notoriously difficult. Actuaries have got much better at this as the amount of data they have got available to use has informed their assumptions and their analysis. It has improved dramatically over the last couple of decades, but in the 80s and 90s they got it woefully wrong before my time, I can thankfully say, and they underestimated how long people are going to live. We've now caught up with that, and we carry out bespoke analysis for your fund. So in other words, we look at your membership specifically to set the mortality assumptions. And the reason that that's so important is because there's a number of factors that impact how long people will live in general. At a high level, we can't pinpoint how long everyone's going to live, but there are a number of factors that you'll have read about that you know. So locations are a classic, where the people in the south of England will live generally longer than the people in the north of England, and way longer than people like me in Glasgow. Lifestyle is another one, and a proxy for lifestyle is pension amount or salary. So those who are more affluent tend to live longer. The type of occupation, type of job they carried out, and so on and so on. We analyse all these factors to try and get the most accurate picture of life expectancy that we can get. And so there's several elements to this, but the first one is the base mortality assumption, and that is to say we look at all the past data that we have available, and we predict how long people will live today for each age group. The second step is then to build in what we used to call them life improvements and life expectancy improvements in the future, and that's probably still the case, but those future improvements have been slowing down. So the future changes in mortality. How do we think that a 45-year-old today, how long do we think they'll live by the time they get to 65, say, and they take their pension? So if we think a 65-year-old will live 20 years and receive a pension for 20 years to age 85, currently, how long do we think that 45-year-old will live by the time, in 20 years' time when they get to 65? So that's the kind of improvement part. And that's very difficult. It's getting more and more difficult to predict. And the reason is that box in the bottom, there's lots of bottom right-hand corner, there's lots of uncertainty. There was always lots of uncertainty, possibly even more so now, but I'll talk about COVID and the impact of that in a moment. This is what's been happening on page 25. So this is quite a complicated chart, but the blue dots are kind of the mortality improvements in each year since 2000 to 2011. And very broadly, that translates into, in English, people are living about 2 years longer per decade. And that's been going on for 100 years. It's quite a kind of straight line ever since the NHS was set up and there's medical advancements, so that was the case. Since 2011, so way before COVID time, we saw that trend changing, which is why we've got the sort of blue dashed line. That's where actuaries and longevity experts were expecting it to go, and that's changed. It started, you can still see the yellow line is sloping downwards, so life expectancy is still improving, but it's improving at a much slower rate. And there's a couple of sort of blips in 2015. You can see the yellow dot was, it was almost, it was higher than the yellow line. We're almost back to kind of 2009-10 levels, and that's because the vaccine given out against flu was ineffective, and we had a particularly bad winter, so we had quite a lot of deaths that year, unfortunately. The big news, of course, is that red dot 2020 is because of COVID and what's been going on in the last year and a half. So that's in fact had a big impact on the number of deaths. We can see there in the green boxes some horrible statistics around that. And in more detail on page 26 of your pack, this shows the impact of COVID since January 2020. So the green bars here are the deaths not involving COVID, and the blue bars are what we'd probably call the excess deaths because of COVID. So we can see, as you'd expect, the big spike at February and March, April time in 2020, and then again around Christmas time into January, February at 21. I guess the key point here, and so there's no surprises there. The key point here is the dashed line is the rolling 5-year average. So that's where we would probably expect it to be, and so anything in excess of that is what we probably call or look at excess as excess deaths because of COVID. So I guess a couple of interesting things here. Life expectancy, if you look to the left-hand side of the chart, there was actually fewer deaths than the rolling 5-year average before COVID really kicked in. So we were still seeing a bit of improvement. But obviously that picture's changed slightly as we moved from left to right. And at the right-hand side, even there's a bit of a recording issue going on here, because even there's some green, but a bit of the green bar above the rolling 5-year average as we move across to sort of the right-hand side, November 21, which would imply that life expectancy, or rather the number of deaths, is, even ignoring COVID, has increased. But we think that's a bit of a recording issues, and in fact some of those might be COVID related or indirectly related, in that people who aren't getting treatment for other things are unfortunately dying because of that, and therefore the number of deaths has increased. So all that's very depressing news. We did carry out some analysis for your fund, and we've got lots of charts on this, but I've tried to boil it down to the simpler one given the time that we have. What we have here for your fund is in the orange bars the number of expected deaths. So according to our assumptions at 2019, we expected around 347 deaths of males and 380 females. And the blue bars have shown what's actually happened to date, so they're quite a bit higher. The chart on the right, with the bar chart on the right, sorry, is the same thing, but showing in terms of the number of people, the actual amount of pension that ceased. So in other words, those members who've died on the left-hand chart, these are the pensions they were receiving on the right. And that is much closer than to what we assumed. So in fact, the point about that is, although we've had lots and lots of news about COVID and the impact, we actually think the impact, and the impact on life and everyone's lives, the impact on the pension fund is going to be fairly minor. There will be a small reduction in the liabilities, but there's not going to be a big impact, and that's because those members who have unfortunately died because of COVID has mainly been those members who are much older, so the older age bands of 80 plus, and therefore they wouldn't have received pension for that much longer anyway, or we wouldn't have expected them to receive pension for that much longer anyway, and they also had smaller pension amounts, and so there's not such a big difference here, which means that the impact on the liabilities is probably to only reduce them by around 1% or so. So, unless there's any questions on that, I'll move on to section 3. Okay.
No questions.
Okay. So the next part, this is very easy. The next part is very quick: how to value the assets. But the point here, I said at the start, the assets are whatever the market value of all the asset classes you're holding as at the valuation date. But what the difficult part is, or the work we need to do as part of the valuation, is to allocate or proportion those assets to each employer in the fund. And it's effectively just like a bank account, or what we call a cash flow approach. So we'll have allocated assets at 31st March 2019. Each employer will have paid contributions in to their pot of assets. The fund will have paid benefits out on their behalf to pensioners and other beneficiaries. So that's a debit coming out of their pot, and the fund will have achieved good investment returns over the last 2.5 years. and so you add those investment returns on to the assets they had at the start, and that will give us the assets at 31st March 2022. So it's fairly straightforward. There's nothing too difficult in that. So that's fine. The only thing I should mention, sorry, for consistency, because we smooth the assumptions and therefore we can smooth the liabilities, we do a bit of smoothing on the assets. So we allow for, again, the assets at 31st March 2022, we'll smooth those out so it won't be the exact market value, because again, taking the March 20 example, if your assets had plummeted 15% because of COVID last year, we wouldn't have thought that was a fair reflection of what they're valued at for the long term. So they'd have been brought up a bit, they would have cancelled out some of that drop. And that's to get consistency with the liabilities. And so, okay, on to section 4. This is all about setting contribution rates for each employer in the fund. I mentioned earlier that there's 2 elements to this. There's a primary rate, or what used to be called the future service rate, because it's the cost of the benefits accruing in the future for all of the employees. We then we've calculated the assets and liabilities by this point, so we know whether each employer has a deficit or a surplus, and we spread that deficit or surplus over an appropriate period of time, and that period of time is dependent on the covenant of the employer and the type of employer and how long we think they'll be in the fund. So for the councils, it might be something like 20 years because they're going to be around forever, whereas for a contractor who's only got a contract length of 5 years to go, then obviously it would be over 5 years or something, potentially even less than that. And that gives us the secondary, or what we call what we now have to call the secondary rate, but used to be called the deficit contribution. So that's just the making up the debt or the deficit over a period, that recovery period, that period of time. And that added to the primary rate, that gives us the total contribution rate, which is certified in the rates and adjustment certificate as part of the valuation report, which will be sort of completing by about this time next year. So just on that, what impacts the employer contribution rate? The main thing on the primary rate is the membership profile, and a simple example is the younger the members, the lower the primary rate, and the older members will have a higher primary rate. And that's just because it's a bit like if anyone's got their own pension pot or anything, any money saved up, the older you are, you've got less time. If you're taking that pot out for retirement, you've got less time to accrue investment returns. And so 1/49th of pay accruing for a 60-year-old will be a lot more expensive than for a 20-year-old, because you're going to be, that benefit, let's say that benefit's the same amount, it's £1,000, you're going to be paying that out in 5 years' time for the 60-year-old, whereas you've got 45 years to, and it's back to that idea of compound interest, so it's much cheaper or lower cost for younger members. The secondary rate, where I just talked about it, and the point here is we can either express that as a monetary amount, a lump sum, or a percentage of payroll, and we decide with the officers in the fund what we do for each employer depending on their circumstances. And then there's an element around employer covenant and whether they've got guarantees or some form of security in place. If an employer has a guarantee or security, then the fund can be more relaxed about how long they give them to pay back a debt, because you expect them to be around for a while. You expect them to have someone to pick up that deficit if they're not around. So a strong employer covenant means we can be a bit more flexible and relaxed when setting contributions, and vice versa. If we think they're a weaker employer, then you probably want to get the money in quicker. It's an analogy might be when people use these websites to Wonga or whatever to borrow money, and you get a credit rating from Experian, and your higher rating means you get a lower rate of interest, that kind of thing. And lastly, on this is the funding strategy statement, which is effectively the Bible or the framework of how we need to carry out the valuation, and we review that with the fund every 3 years and update it, and we obviously carry out the valuation in accordance with the rules that are in that funding strategy statement or the guidance that's in there. And just back to that point I mentioned at the start of balancing affordability and stability with solvency, in other words, looking after the fund, making sure there's enough money, and long-term cost efficiency, which effectively means not kicking the can down the road and making sure that we're not passing on debt or cost to future generations. So that's everything on the valuation process. Just the last couple of slides on pages on key issues or hot topics that will impact the fund and particularly the valuation. The first one, hopefully you've all heard about McLeod. This is the age discrimination case. Oh God, which started back in so the scheme changed, the LGPS scheme changed in 2014 and was moved to a care scheme, and those within 10 years of retirement were protected. So in other words, if the old scheme, the final salary scheme, would have provided a higher benefit, then those members within 10 years of retirement would get that higher benefit rather than the new care benefit. That was deemed to be unfair on grounds of age, and so it went to court. Government appealed it, they lost, and as you probably know the background history, but we're now in a position where that's going to be remedied, and we've got a very good idea of the remedy, but unfortunately it's not in the regulations, and it won't be in the regulations, we believe, until at least the 1st of April 2023. So it's not going to be in the regulations for the 2022 valuation. So we will need to make a small allowance for the additional cost of this, but we do think it's fairly small. Well, fairly small over the scheme as a whole and the fund as a whole, but there could be some employers that have got a more significant cost, which we'll build in. The biggest problem here, unfortunately, is for the fund's admin team, because there's going to be lots of, it's a huge project to carry out to check every member's benefit. The first big element of that is getting the right data to be able to do that check. And so, as I've said many times, never has so much work been done for so few, because there's relatively few people in the LGPS are going to benefit from this, but there's going to be a huge amount of work that has to be done to evidence that, unfortunately. So anyway, the point is, from the valuation purposes, we will build in an allowance from McLeod. Then there's the cost management process. The background to this was that the cost of the new scheme being from 2014, the care scheme was 19.5%, and the cost would be split roughly 2 to 1. So the employer would pay 13 and the employee would pay 6.5, very broadly. But there's a mechanism in there to always bring the cost back to 19.5%. If the cost started creeping up, they would change the benefits to bring it back down, and vice versa. If the benefits, the cost has gone down, they enhance the benefits to bring it back up. And at the very first time of doing this review, because life expectancy had been slowing down and because salary increases had been so low, the cost had been deemed to go down. So they were going to have to improve benefits. But then McLeod came along and paused all that from January 2018. And we are still kind of waiting for how that's going to all pan out. So, but something else we'll need to think about. And then the last one here on this page is the exit reform. This is the fact that if you were retiring early and your benefit package was over 95,000, then it would be capped. And again, that was deemed it was contradictory to regulations that were in at the time, and so the whole reform is revoked. And so we're still waiting to hear about that too. So there's lots of things we're kind of waiting to hear that are stuck with the ministers, unfortunately, but they may or may not come out before the valuation kicks in, or worst case, actually during the process. But things we'll need to build into the valuation and think about. And lastly is just sort of some other key issues. We've already talked about COVID and how that will impact mortality and morbidity. Climate emergency or climate risk, another key one that we're looking at for a number of funds. I know that the fund's already done work on it on the asset side and with your investment advisors. So that's kind of taken care of from that point of view. We can respond to the fund, and we've talked about carrying out some scenario analysis, but to be honest, it probably doesn't add too much. But we will be building again something in just to allow for what you've done on the investment side. And then lastly, is this news around long-term or short-term inflation, but what that means for long-term inflation. We're obviously seeing a spike in inflation. Is it just a spike? Do we think it'll disappear quite quickly, or do we think it's going to have a longer-term impact? And coincidentally, I've got a paper to review this week and on which impacts our assumptions and how we think inflation might play out both in the short and long term, and therefore what we should do about it at the valuation. Gut feeling is it's a kind of, it might be around for a little while, but it's fairly short term, and there's quite a few reasons for that in terms of supply demand chains and government interventions and so on that will disappear, and therefore inflation will settle back down. But there are other arguments, I guess, around fuel prices, energy prices, and the real key issues, I guess, whether wage inflation takes off, and if it does, then will that keep price inflation higher for longer? So it's something we're looking at and we need to build into the valuation assumptions. So I won't talk about how we can help your fund, and I'll just pause there, given I've had my half hour, but happy to take any more questions.
Any questions? Right. Councillor Purdue.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you very much for that presentation. It's very helpful. I'm going to ask an unfair question, if I may, Mr. Chairman. Generally, could I ask our colleague, is his view more gloomy of the future or more optimistic? Which is it?
Yeah, I'm quite an optimistic person, so I think if I answered that from the consensus of experts, opinion of experts, I would say it's more gloomy. I would say that investment returns are going to be more difficult to find in the future relative to what they have been in the past. Inflation may take off. We've got other political issues to deal with, like Brexit and so on, that are pushing inflation up as well. We've got climate risk, which is a real issue and will cause some sectors to have problems generating income, profit returns, so on. But my personal view is that I think there's a lot of bright people out there. There's a lot of innovation when companies are faced with these problems. The good ones innovate and get through it, and in fact come out even stronger. And therefore, we might see some companies disappear, but some thrive. And the point there is that hopefully investment returns, therefore, will continue to be strong as they have been in the LGPS funds for the last 20, 25 years. And also the fund, your fund as well, you're looking at trying to generate those returns in different ways while not increasing risk materially. So moving into infrastructure and those sorts of things that also benefit the environment and communities and everything else. So I'm kind of optimistic, but I'm not sure that would be the view held by everyone, to be honest.
Okay. John, would you like to come in?
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Barry, you've just obviously at the beginning talked about the 93% funding level at the last valuation. Obviously, you'll look at your assumptions again at this valuation, but based on the last valuation, where is the fund now in terms of funding level based on those assumptions, say at the 30th of September, just to give members an idea of, I think I know the answer is going to be somewhere. It's been pretty successful vis-a-vis what you thought, but could you just give us an indication of where you think the fund was at 30th of September?
Yeah, I omitted that deliberately. So, but thanks for the question. We haven't done a funding update recently, but my gut feeling is, having done funding updates for other LGPS funds, is the asset returns have been very strong.
Yeah.
Over the last 2.5 years, assets have done very well. I think I mentioned you're over 6 billion at 31st March 21. You'll be up in a bit more as at 30th September, as you asked about, John. So the assets have performed well in advance, well ahead of the discount rate, which was 4.7, I think 4.8% at the last valuation. The fund will have beaten that comfortably. The problem is the liabilities will have grown as well. The first thing is there's interest in the liabilities. That's what we apply as a discount rate. Second thing is there'll be more benefits accrued over the last 3 years. And the third thing is, I guess, that the assumptions, there will be a change in assumptions come 2022. Inflation, as we say, might be up slightly, and the discount rate might be down slightly, and that pushes the liabilities up. So, having said all that, I can't give you a number, but I think the funding level will be up from 93, so somewhere between 93 and 100%. But we haven't done those calculations. Happy to do them if the funder or the board want to know what an estimate is at 3rd September, for example, or even now.
I wasn't really, asking for a specific figure, but I just wanted to clarify that, as I think you'd heavily hinted, it's above the 93.
The direction of travel for funds is that the funding level is up. On the contribution rate is a different question, as you know, John, because the funding level's up, which means that what I talked about, the secondary rate contributions will come down because the deficit's smaller. But what we call the primary contribution rate has probably gone up since 2019, and that's because assets and liabilities don't have anything to do with that. It's what's happening in the future, and therefore primary rate up, secondary rate down. We might be able to keep contribution rates roughly where they are.
Thanks, Barry.
Sure.
Mr. Chairman.
Councillor Perdue-Horan.
I looked at the forecast for the weather yesterday, and it said for the next 2 days it's going to be foggy in this area. And I think it's perhaps it's ironic we're meeting today, because I think you could actually use that term for the difficulties our experts have in predicting the future, both in what we know is unknown, where we have children born today who will very likely live to 100. That's the predictions. We won't be around to worry about that, of course. And of course, we have this ongoing situation with COVID and the effects of Brexit. And I was a supporter of Brexit, but I realise there are always challenges, and we're dealing with that fog today. And thank you for all the work you're doing, because it's certainly not easy, and it's certainly putting more. I'm sure all members approach, the governance and investments of the pension scheme very seriously, but it just simply adds more pressure to our staff and members to make sure that this fund weathers those storms, really.
Yeah, yeah. Thanks for that comment. I've been doing this for 25 years, and I qualified about 15 years ago. So I've been through 6 valuation cycles with the LGPS, and I couldn't agree more. It's probably never been more difficult than it's going to be this time to set the assumptions, which is why, as I said earlier, I've got a draft paper to look at already before March, just because we want to get ahead of this and start speaking to funds about what it might look like. And one thing I didn't mention in my presentation, just in the interest of time, is that we'll be, constantly in correspondence and meetings with the officers and the committee and yourselves to keep you informed of what's going on, and there's a number of data requirements we've got, which is, as I said earlier, is absolutely key. So thanks to the fund for all the good work they've been doing on the data side.
Thank you. I'll offer any questions. John, I can see you've got your hand up. Is that a legacy hand, or is that a new question?
It was a legacy.
All right. Actually, there was a question which I'll throw out, which is you did ask to say that did we want to have a valuation at the 31st of September? Can I just ask a question, which is that obviously we'll get the valuation in March. Is there any value in getting the valuation done for the 31st of September, or are we best waiting until the true valuation in March?
Sorry, thanks, Chair. So the valuation at 3rd September can be done very quickly. That was all I was meaning, because it's an estimate. It's what we call a kind of roll forward from the last full valuation. So we can do that in a couple of days. Whereas the formal valuation, we need all the data, and as I mentioned, that John and the team and Tamsin teams will provide, and that whole valuation process takes best part of a year. So we won't know the 2022 valuation results until about next September, October time. So it's just, but whereas we can do the 3rd September one in a couple of days and give you an update, but entirely up to the fund. I can speak to Keith and others if that's something that might be helpful.
Right, David?
I personally wouldn't have thought it was necessary at all, because I do remember a presentation about 2 years ago saying that the funding rate was getting far better or whatever, so by March 2020 everything would be fantastic from a funding perspective, and then we had COVID and the stock market dropped just before the 31st of March and the liabilities obviously increased substantially. So for me, I'll be waiting till get the actual results out on the 31st of March 2022, despite we having to wait 9 to 12 months to get those numbers.
Right, is that the feeling of everyone? Right. Thank you. Thank you very much for your presentation, Barry. And the other thing will be, I'm sure probably as we work through the rest of the agenda, there might be questions that might come up relating to your presentation. Will you be happy for us to forward you any questions that come through that? If you don't hear from us, take it that there hasn't been any further questions. So first question is, are you happy to take any other questions at the end of the year that come out of the meeting?
Of course, yeah, I'm happy to take them, and I'm happy to stay on if that'd be helpful. If I stay on the call, if that'd be helpful.
Right. Yep, we're quite happy for you to stay on if that's all right, and if that works within your schedule.
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay. Thank you very much for your presentation. Very informative, and look forward to hearing, hopefully, that we're above the 100% valuation when it comes through. Okay. Next item on the board, on the meeting, is the Local Government Pension Scheme Transforming Administration Update. And this is just an update on the data audit and improvement work stream within the Transforming Pension Administration through Digital Development and New Ways of Working program. John, would you like to take us through? Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. I'm going to present this on behalf of Sarah because I should have mentioned earlier, apologies for Sarah, she can't attend today. So I'll quickly go through the report and then take questions. As the Chair said, the purpose of the report is really to update the board on the data audit, and obviously it links into some of the work that we will be doing on the evaluation as we progress towards the end of the year. So it does actually fit that process. As you're aware, the improvement in the work stream is about transforming pensions administration, and this is linked. Improvement of data is actually linked to quite a lot of activities that we've got planned. So the Pension Board will be aware from previous reports that there are a number of activities that have been happening over time which impact on the LGPS and in particular pensions administration. Therefore, pensions administration has need to mirror these changes and how we deliver our services through, say, increased automation, addressing member data inaccuracies, ensuring employers fulfil their responsibilities, members able to access pension records, along with also meeting the expectations of the pensions regulator. Pensions Committee and Pensions Board have provided support to transform delivery through digital platforms. We have presented on a number of occasions, and I'll mention a couple of those as I go through the presentation. However, data improvement is a critical work stream for the programme. The data audit and the changes will only be successful if our data is accurate. However, a further requirement has also come along. Is being driven by the National Pensions Dashboard implementation, of which we understand that the LGPS will be in one of the first tranches planned, and I just stress planned for 2023. So, like I say, our data has to be up to date to meet that requirement. You'll see from the report that work on the scheme specific and common data has improved our data score, and this has been achieved through our phases 1, 2 and phase 3 of our project. And we now have a data quality dashboard as well, which allows the fund to review the data position for each of the scheme employers. However, in order to complete the final stages of phase 3, the date of the data audit, we have been granted further funding of 264,000, which was approved by the Pension Committee as of the 4th of November. The next phase will be now to interact directly with scheme employers to resolve data queries. So we'll be sending data out to scheme employers, and scheme employers will have to respond back, hopefully, to those issues that we highlight. The phase 4 will ensure processes are in place also to maintain the quality of data, and this is where we want to start to implement monthly scheme returns and to start to plan for the deployment of member self-service. So again, this meets the data audit meets those aspirations. Just to update you as well, the scheme employer portal is rolling out, and the fund has continued to roll out to some of the larger scheme employers, such as the districts and obviously to the county. And we've got a plan to roll out further to some of the larger multi-academy trusts. To do all this, we have needed to look at our resources, and I can report that the Pensions Committee have approved some permanent and temporary funding for additional resources to support the fund, in particular to support us against the MacLeod project, but also to help us achieve other crossover activities in relation to our GMP project and other project work that we have planned. So the fund has currently now advertised a number of posts, and we're waiting to see how we get on with that recruitment over the next number of weeks. So that concludes my presentation on the report. If there are any questions, obviously happy to take them.
Right, I'm just having a look around the room. David?
It's not a question, but it's really praising you in reality, because I thought that the improvement has been substantial over the last year, particularly with the number of amendments going down. I thought it was in 1 year, it's particularly significant, really. And I'm just wondering whether you targeted better than that, or you targeted less than that and you've improved. I know that's a leading question, but what is the target for the next year?
Well, that's a really good question. We should really, in terms of our common data and scheme-specific data, we should be up into the 90s, and that's what the expectation of the pensions regulator is. So I suppose really the work that we have done has kicked that off. The real work will come when we go out to scheme employers and to check that data. So yeah, it's up into the 90s really.
And when are the employers likely to get some feedback as regards to what they need to do?
A couple of things. We have had a bit of a problem with our admin system, and we're a little bit behind the curve on this. Fortunately, that's been resolved, and it was all around loading of data. So until we were able to satisfy ourselves we could load data properly into our admin system, we couldn't really send data out to scheme employers. So that is currently being tested now, and hopefully that testing will be completed after into the new year. And we hope to be sending requests out to scheme employers certainly January, February time, and ongoing through the year. I have to say though, there's going to be quite a bit of work for scheme employers over the coming year. First of all, we've got our data improvement. We've also going to go out to scheme employers requesting data for MacLeod. And also, as you've heard from Barry, we've got the valuation data and year-end data. So there's quite a lot of work, and we're going to have to stagger some of that and look at what our priorities actually are. Clearly, the valuation is a priority, as is year-end data. So it is going to be a busy year for scheme employers as well as the fund.
Okay, John, thank you.
Mark?
Just one question, John. You spoke about members' self-service. Can you explain a little bit more about that one, please?
Yes, thank you. Member self-service. What that will be is basically a portal where members can view and update their data in real time. So similar to what's a good, looking on Amazon, for example. So you'll be able to see members will be able to see their data, see what their contributions have been, and will be able to, so for example, if they move address, they'll be able to update some of their data in real time in terms of doing things online. That has, just as a report, that has been a challenge for LGPS funds, because getting people to do that, whilst that sounds quite easy, is a challenge, and some funds in the early stages were only able to get sort of 20-30% engagement in that type of activity. But that's something that we need to progress over the coming months. Probably towards the end of next year will we start that, because of all the other work that we have to do. But that is an aspiration for the fund, to be able to do that. And really what we then want to do is to then move to members seeking estimates of benefit and being able to look at that kind of data going forward.
Regarding that one, John, I mean, if you can keep that in bearing in mind about, can I say, without being disrespectful, about one size don't fit all, and it being user friendly, because a lot of the questions that I get asked is, can you please explain this statement to me?
We appreciate that, and the complexities of the LGPS lends itself to those types of questions. Because really, what we're doing is we're administering three pension schemes. We've got the pre-2008, the post-2008 scheme, and then the 2014 scheme, and it does make it quite complicated. So we appreciate that, and we'll do everything we can to try and make it as easy as possible. I think that's all I can say about that, really.
Thank you, John. I've just got a couple, and they're IT related. What has been the take-up of the portal rollout? And I think David mentioned about some feedback, but also in terms of members using the portal themselves, do we have a cybersecurity or some way of ensuring that information or people can't get into the system? Thank you.
Some good questions there, Chair. First of all, in terms of the employer portal, we've rolled out to the districts, because they're one of our bigger members. We've rolled out to the county council. So it's a case of picking off employers. The engagement with employers has been good. Every time we've gone out to them, they have engaged, and we've given them access. So that's not a problem. The problem is the number of scheme employers that we have, and trying to roll it out on an effective basis. So we are due to actually recruit an additional member of staff to support that rollout going forward. In terms of cyber security, as you're aware, Chair, when you attended the pool admin board meeting, that did come up on the agenda, and we started to look into that so that we can bring a report to yourselves and Pensions Committee about cyber security. We're confident that we have cyber security in place because we use the county council's IT infrastructure, but quite rightly we need to report to yourself in relation to the fund, and that's something that we will be doing, and I have put it on the work plan.
Thank you very much. Any further questions to John? No, thank you very much for your presentation and for us standing in for Sarah. Thank you. Right, the recommendation is that we have a look, that we note the, and I'll read them through, note the progress and ongoing work taking place within the data audit and improvement work stream, and agree to receive the ongoing update reports on the progress of the program. I'm happy to move. Can I have a seconder? Thank you very much. Right, the next item is the revision of the fund strategy documents, and this is quite a weighty title. So what I'll do is I will ask, and I believe it falls to Mr. Keith Palfreman to take us through.
Thank you, Chair. The fund's required to prepare, maintain and publish a number of strategy statements, which must then be kept under review and, if necessary, revised. This report updates the board on the review undertaken by the Pension Fund Committee in September, and the report summarises the key changes. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much. Very brief. Actually, it's very rare that you get an answer that's shorter than the title, but thank you very much. Right, have we got any questions to Keith? Having a look around the room. John, we've got a question from John on Zoom.
It's just a comment, really, Chair. This report I thought was excellent because some very difficult and complicated strategies are discussed there, and I think Keith has summarised brilliantly these strategies in a very concise way, which I think is helpful to members rather than producing oodles of paper, which may be more confusing than illuminating. So I think it's really good. That's just my thought.
Thank you very much, John, and I think it's something that's echoed within the meeting. So thank you very much, Keith, and we'll move on. And as I said, the recommendation is that we note the recent review of the administration strategy, climate strategy, communication strategy, funding strategy statement, governance compliance statement, investment strategy statement, and risk management strategy and risk register documents by the Nottinghamshire Pension Fund Committee. I'm happy to move that. Can I have a seconder? Thank you very much. Sorry, Councillor Purdy-Oran.
Apologies, I don't know if this is the right point to raise this. It could also come under risk register. There was an incident at full council that came up at full council with regard to the employment of an individual. And the upshot of it was that the county council breached local government regulations in employing a former councillor. Now, I noticed in the risk register that it makes a point that members are required to have suitable training in both, obviously, both the Pensions Committee and the Pensions Board. What it doesn't make clear is that, or transparent, is that there perhaps is a appropriate training for members of staff, because what came out of that issue, which was completely different to this, of course, was it was a training issue that the people who were responsible for employing somebody were not fully aware of the law, and it just made me wonder when I caught that: is it something we should make explicit that training, appropriate training for staff is part of the governance arrangements? That's my query.
I think that's to John and Keith. John, do you want to take?
Trying to answer that, you're absolutely right, Councillor, in terms of training. And currently, there's a governance project that's been going on over the past, 2 to 3 years, nationally around LGPS governance. And that picks up around training of pension board members, committee members, plus also officers of the fund. And there is a report and recommendations due to come to it will come to pension board and pensions committee in the near future. We're waiting for regulations to be established by by government in relation to the recommendations of this project that's been ongoing. So there is actually a draft report done for Pension Board and Pensions Committee which will pick up exactly on those particular points that you've raised. And they are going to be, I believe they're going to be part of the LGPS regulations in terms of training for senior officers within the pension fund. So you're quite right to raise it. It is being addressed and will be addressed in a report once the department, I'm going to say MHCLG, but it's not that now, when they've brought forward their proposals and regulations. But there is a drafted report for committee and for yourselves in relation to take that forward.
Thank you for your answer, John. And I think we've got John on Zoom with a hand up.
Sorry, Chair, it's a legacy.
All right. Okay. Thank you. All right. So I think, again, I'm happy to move the recommendation. Are we all happy to move the recommendation? And thank you, Councillor Purdue, for bringing up that item about the staff also needing training as much as the committee members and the pension board members. Thank you. We shall move on to the agenda item 7, which is, sorry, I've just turned over some pages. The local government pension scheme breaches log. And it's John Clues taking us through this. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. This is just hopefully just a brief report for you. The purpose of the report is to inform the Pension Board of the policy and processes being used by the pension fund to identify, record and report statutory breaches of the LGPS and related regulations. The fund is required to comply with the Pension Regulator's Code of Practice, which is being reviewed at this point in time. And the policy documents outlines the decision processes in relation to reporting breaches of law as they apply to the management of the administration of the fund. Just as an example, to give you a bit of context to it, I've previously reported to the board and to committee where scheme employers have not provided their statutory data to enable the fund to produce benefit statements. I think I've mentioned it in my presentations around performance. So where we're not able to produce benefit statements because of missing data, this is regarded as a statutory breach. And the pension fund, on occasions, has reported scheme employers to the pensions regulator. Again, I think I've said that in a number of meetings. So really, the policy that is outlined here is formalising what we already do and ensuring that we have a breaches log. So really, what I've done is I've produced this policy based on, well, to bring us really up to date and to be much clearer in how we do report breaches of statutory breaches. So I've attached also a report log, and what we will be doing is when we identify any breaches, we will be recording them and reporting them. So that's really my report. I don't know whether you have any questions on this. I can pick up.
David?
Is the intention that the board look at the log in detail, or is it just something that you're keeping as a memorandum, effectively?
I think what I was proposing to do was to just include it in my performance report each year, so that you have a view of some of the breaches that may have occurred and what we've done to mitigate them. I think hopefully, we don't really want to be going to the pensions regulator. And like I said, we have done in the past, and we've actually fined some employers. I say fined, we've charged them additional administration costs. And there are one or two employers who continually give us a few issues going forward, and we do work with them. There are other breaches as well, but I think this is a good talking point and outlines some of the issues that we have. So just as an example, for this year's year end, we generally start to produce our benefit statements towards the end of July, beginning of August. We start to print, and we always say to scheme employers that we need your data. We give them a date of around the 14th, 15th of May. So that gives us time to check any issues in the data before we then load it into the admin system and then produce the benefit statements. One particular employer, we didn't get their actual data. We didn't get their data into the system until I think it was something like the 28th, 29th of August, of July, sorry, prior to us running the benefit statements. And that was just sheer fact that they hadn't been able to get the data to us. Now, there were some reasons for that. Obviously, it's not the pension fund's responsibility in terms of those reasons. Fortunately now, having spoken to them, they are bringing their activity or their payroll activity back in-house because it was outsourced elsewhere. So hopefully next year we'll have we'll be in a better position. So that's just an example, really.
Thank you very much. I can see that there isn't any questions, any further questions. Are we happy to go with the recommendation that we adopt the procedure outlined in the policy document and to record and report the statutory breaches of the local pension scheme regulations? I'm happy to move it. I'm happy to move it. Thank you very much. Right, the next item is the pension fund risk register. And this is just a presentation of the current fund risk register to the board. And I believe it's Kieran to take us through. Kieran, are you ready?
I didn't realise I was presenting this one because there's been no changes to the risk register since the last meeting. There was a question raised at the last meeting regarding rates of return, and I think I'm hoping that Martin would have circulated my response to that, which I provided to him shortly after the previous meeting. But apart from that, there's nothing to add. Thank you, Chair.
Right. Okay, I can just update that that Martin did circulate it, and thank you very much for that, Martin, and yourself. And just an update, which is actually it's John Clues who's going to take us through the risk register.
Thank you, Chair. It was I was going to pick up some of the admin risks, which I thought was worth highlighting. And given some of the questions today, I think it'd be worth just having a quick look. So, in terms of the risk register, just to cover off some of the major, or I say major, that's not quite right. Sort of the high level risks that we've identified in the register. Risk governance 4, which is a high risk, which relates to resources. I just wanted to highlight and reaffirm what we're doing around this risk. So this is around resources available to manage the pension fund. This does remain a high risk. as I said earlier in one of my previous presentations, we do and we have been provided with additional funding to hopefully mitigate some of that resource risk. And what we will be doing, hopefully, fingers crossed, is that we will be able to recruit to those posts and to, like I say, mitigate that risk going forward. There is going to be quite a bit of work to do because whilst you get new people into the pensions administration, it's around training them and sort of try to keep them in the team. We have actually had 2 resignations over the last 2 months, one retiring and one person going elsewhere. So it's a constant risk for us. And to be fair, most of the pension funds are actually having a problem in recruiting at the moment. So there is some work going on nationally to look at recruitment and to look at training and to see what support can be offered to pension funds going forward. But just to say, if you have a look in the across the funds, a lot of them are trying to recruit at this point in time. One of the other risks we've identified in admin relates to data and the work of the data improvement, and hence we're mitigating that because of that, the work that we're trying to do. But we've left them as high at the moment because obviously we haven't finished the work, but hopefully the report prior to this is mitigating some of that risk. Risk admin number 4 is around working on valuation data. Again, hopefully the breaches log and the admin strategy, which was in Keith's report, again, it's to help us meet our statutory requirements with our scheme employers. Just in terms of risk admin 5, and this comes back to your question, Chair, in relation to data security. And as I said, we will be bringing a report to you to show the mitigation, hopefully, of that issue. And then finally, risk admin 5, which is around communication. One thing that is actually happening and looking at communication, and Mark's highlighted some of that, is that we're looking to update our website, and we're also looking to rebrand the pension fund and to have our own, I know it sounds a bit trite, but have our own logo and to show that the pension fund is the pension fund and to sort of not take it away from the county council, but the pension fund is highlight it. Thank you. Yes. So I just wanted to point out those 5 areas just to show that, or just to inform you that things are happening in those areas. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Any questions? Can't see anything on those who are doing it online and not in the room. I've got actually just a thank you actually, which is I like the idea that the pensions is going to have its own website with its own logo, because I think sometimes that's always been the thing that, and Mark mentioned it earlier, which is when people want information, it's good for them to be able to go onto a separate scheme, onto a separate site, which should have all that information. So thank you very much for that. Right, so the action, so the recommendation on here is that we accept it. Can I have somebody to move it? Well, I'll move it, and agreed. Thank you very much. And then last item is the Pension Board Work Programme 2021 to 2022. And this is again John, do you want to take us through?
Sorry, Chair, I can pick up a couple of things just to highlight. So I think the main activity is, as I said, we've put the cybersecurity report in. Hopefully it'll be ready for March. But obviously I'll keep that updated. We're going to be attending the governance conference in March, in February. So I hope to bring a report in March. That's obviously if it goes ahead. The other things that I've put to be placed, going back to Councillor Purdue-Horan's question in relation to the training, that report has been listed to come to yourselves, and once that's moved on, we'll place it on a particular meeting. I don't think there's much else I can say about the work plan, unless there's any particular questions about it.
Any particular questions on the work plan? Mark?
Just a quick one, John, regarding the previous minutes. It said there will also be specific training regarding pension scams for committee and pension board members. Has that been?
We haven't planned that in. We haven't planned that in yet, Mark, and you're right to remind me of that. So I will make sure that's on the plan. One of the new posts that we are recruiting to is going to be helping to administer those transfers, and to try and make sure that they're on. I'm trying to put this in the right way, that we're able to mitigate any scams in relation to transfers. But you're quite right to remind me, and I will make sure that's on the plan.
Right, any further questions? No. I've got just one, which is, I know that at the moment we're trying to recruit more members to the board. How's that going? And number two, I know that it would be good for us to have what would be a welcome pack or an information pack for new members. So if you could just give us an update on that, John. Thank you.
I could give you an update in terms of welcome pack. I have asked some other funds actually for examples of their welcome packs, so that we can use some of their ideas in terms. I didn't want to use the word copying, but use some of their ideas in terms of that. So that is on our work plan to do, Chair. In terms of the recruitment to the Pensions Board, Martin and I have discussed that, and we will be issuing something round to scheme employers in the new year around recruiting to the Pension Board. That's one of the ideas that we've got.
Martin?
Chairman, I should perhaps say that we did run a recruitment exercise in the press and online during October, and we didn't have a single applicant to join this board, unfortunately, which is why John and I are going to do some more targeted work in the new year and try and drum up some applicants.
Thank you very much. And in terms of that, is there anything that we as the existing board can do to help you with that?
To be honest, Chair, I don't know. I think once we have come up with a bit of a campaign, for want of a better phrase, we can report that back to you and we can have a chat about that, just to see if there's any further ideas. So if you'd like to, we can contact you in the new year and talk about it. Is that okay, Paul?
Thank you very much. And I think the action for this item is really just to assist the pension board, so to assist that we consider any amendments that are required to the work program. And I think we've kind of talked through some of the things that we wish to add. And if there is nothing else to add, just like to thank you everyone for attending the meeting, and to wish you all sorry, David?
Just a quick one, Chair. I know we've got the March and June dates already established, but going forward, I thought it's very useful to have at least 4 dates into the future for meetings, because it's easy to get them in the diary sooner rather than later. So if you were able to circulate some proposed dates, then we can hopefully maintain 100% attendance.
Thank you very much for that. And I think it was one of the bits in terms of governance going forward that we should have 4 meetings a year. So it'd be great to have that already put in. So thank you very much for that. Thank you very much for those who have attended online. Thank you very much for those who have attended in person. And I wish you all a safe journey home and Merry Christmas. Thank you. And Stuart, could we stop? Thank you very much.